A warm welcome to episode 24 of Lost for Words with me, your host Jason. This week I am joined by Niamh Quille, and together we discuss the Windrush Scandal. In the late 1940s, thousands of migrants from the West Indies and further afield travelled on the Empire Windursh ship to live in the UK, which was at the time suffering from a post-war labour shortage. Insufficient documentation of these migrants led to a scandal which has reared its head over the past 5 or so years. The Windrush Generation, as they've come to be known, have faced questions over their right to remain in the country, despite helping to shape the UK as we know it today. Thousands of deportations have already taken place. Niamh is a lawyer researcher and wrote an award-winning dissertation which examined the Windrush Generation and the hostile environment that still exists in the UK today. Niamh speaks about the timeline of events regarding the Windrush Scandal, including some of the key players, particularly former Prime Minister and Home Secretary Theresa May. A quick housekeeping note before we get started. Please leave a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Apple, Google, Spotify, Podbean or any other platform. It's the best way the podcast can grow and better content can be produced for you, the listener. It's your listening experience that matters the most. But enough from me, now on to today's episode of Lost for Words. Right, hello Niamh, how are you?
Thanks, Jason, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Have you been busy today?
Fairly busy, but it was raining today, so I had to stay indoors anyway and work from home as usual, so all good.
So we've actually had a nice day here. It's been quite rare. The weather's been up and down, but yeah, all good. Right, I'll just get started then. So just a bit about you before we go into the nitty gritty of what we're going to talk about. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up.
So I was born in Coventry and lived in London and Coventry as a child, and then my father lives in Ireland.
Is that where the surname comes from then? I was thinking that.
And the first name, yeah. So and this is sort of relevant to what we'll be talking about with the Windrush Generation, but my mother's parents are Irish and my father is Irish. So yes, completely Irish and completely English too.
That's a good mix. That's a good mix for the context of what we're talking about. So tell me a bit about school then. Would you say you were always sort of academically inclined, or did you go through school wanting to do something maybe different in a creative field?
I'm not sure about that. I can't say I really enjoyed school. It was I moved schools a few times, so I went to different types of schools. The ones where I really felt like I thrived were probably sort of stricter. I went to a girls' school for a little while, and then in Coventry I went to a mixed secondary school, and that was a bit of a culture shock. But in general, I mean, I never failed an exam or anything, but I wouldn't say that I was particularly academic or top of the class when I was at secondary school. No.
How far along your educational lifespan? So, like, how old were you when you decided a career in law was something you might want to pursue?
To be completely honest, I didn't know what a lawyer did until I was at university. I lived with a law student and I saw the sorts of modules that he was studying, but it didn't interest me until after I graduated. And that was mainly because I realised that being a lawyer is a way that you can make a real difference to a person's life. And that's particularly the case if you work in legal aid law or criminal law, because there are decisions that affect a person's life, and you need somebody who can understand both the law and how it applies to them, but also the circumstances that they're facing. And that was what drew me to it, probably when I was about 22.
See, that's quite a holistic approach, because I think a lot of people's perception of lawyers would be they would get it from the the TV programme Suits, and it's all swanky and corporate and big man fighting the big man, and not really the sort of deep level of, you're saying it affects people's daily lives.
Yeah, I think when I was at university as an undergraduate, I did go to law fairs, but I only saw commercial and corporate areas of law. And I knew that that wasn't for me. So, because I didn't know that there were other areas that would be more kind of what I was interested in doing politically, I didn't think that law was for me in general at that time.
And did you go straight from school, sixth form, to the University of Birmingham?
I did, yeah. I got a place at the University of Birmingham through their access scheme, which was called Access to Birmingham. And that was a scheme for people who had received free school meals, as I had when I was at school, to be able to access higher education.
Good, and how would you describe your experience of university?
Yeah, I loved it. I studied political science, and I really enjoyed that course. I studied lots of electives in British politics and post-Soviet politics, and those were the sorts of things I was really interested in.
And see, as you study these electives, did you, like the things you were studying, did that sort of entrench your own political beliefs, or did it make you aware or change your mind about anything?
I think being in a class of lots of different people, I mean, diverse in the sense that in class and in people, having a class of people who were from different countries meant that lots of my political views were challenged in a way that hadn't happened before. So I wouldn't say they were entrenched, but I also don't know that they changed significantly either. So um, I think perhaps what university teaches you to do, and what I really found um, most valuable about going to university, is that it teaches you to challenge the question and to try to think originally.
Then you went from there to the University of Law, am I right in saying that?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
if you haven't studied law as an undergraduate and you would like to become a lawyer, you have to study a law conversion course, and that's taught by private universities. One of them is the University of Law. There are also a few others,
So
but I
what was the
chose that.
private course? What was the private course that you did through them?
It's called the Graduate Diploma in Law. So it's a law conversion course designed to catch up people who didn't study law undergraduate. If you want to be a solicitor or a barrister, you take that course.
Right, and how long were you there for before you went to Oxford?
It's a 1 year course, and actually I did it part time. So I did it whilst I was working. I did it in the evening, so it took me 2 years.
And then Oxford, what was your experience of being a student there? Did you go, or was it a distance learning?
Yeah, that was a full time course. So I had worked for a law firm, for a solicitor's firm, for 3 years, I think, by that point. And I really enjoyed my role. I worked in public law, but I was quite certain that I wanted to do crime, um, for many reasons. But one of the things was that I felt, although public law is really important, what you do in public law, you challenge a particular policy and you challenge how it affects them, and that was really interesting. But what I wanted to do was have a more um, direct role, really, with the person whose life was being affected by a decision. And for me, crime was where criminal law is where you can make more of a difference, hopefully, in a person's life. So I applied to Oxford because I saw this master's program. It was a program called Criminology and Criminal Justice, and I felt that would be something that, if I got a place on the course, that would teach me more about criminal justice system in this country and in other countries. And I completely applied on a whim. I didn't have the funding, and I didn't really have a proper plan in place, but I knew that I wanted to study as a postgraduate, and I thought it was probably worth making the application just to see if, one, if I would get a place, and then two, if I could find some funding or sponsorship from somewhere. And then I did get a place, and I found there was a scholarship. Almost, it felt like it was tailor-made for me, really, because it was for people from a disadvantaged background who wanted to practice at the criminal bar. So it was a partial scholarship, and when I got that in place, I had to find a little bit of extra cash, and I did take out some loans and things, but then I started, yes, full time, and I had the experience of being part of a college and living in halls again at the age of 26 or 27. So yeah, it was a real privilege, and it was a brilliant opportunity.
And did it live up to all the hopes you had for it in the first place?
Yes and no. I think my approach to it was that it was a really special experience, and it was, so I wanted to try to get involved in as many of the things that students do at Oxford as possible. So I tried rowing, and I spent lots of time in really beautiful library buildings, and met lots of people that from countries and from backgrounds that I'd never met before. I think the experience of being a postgraduate at Oxford, though, is very different to being an undergraduate. The admissions process is quite different, the funding is different, and the tuition is a slightly different format to the small group tutorials that undergraduate students have. So it wasn't what I expected in many respects. And I certainly, once I was there, I didn't find it had the kind of the feeling of elitism that it projects outside of Oxford, and I found that there was a great deal of kind of respect and mutual exchange between students and academics within the college. But there were lots of challenges, as I said earlier, mainly financial. I had a scholarship which covered the majority of my fees, but there was still a shortfall, and I also had to find money for living costs. And I think that for postgraduate study at any institution, that is the barrier that most people will face.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's because, so you saying you were 26 at the time when you went to Oxford?
I think so, yeah.
That's, that would almost be, I think that would be considered a mature student, which
Yeah,
26
exactly.
isn't old. That isn't old, but I think when you compare and contrast that to the vast majority of students being 18 and 19, it's perfectly fair that your experience is going to be different.
Mm, mm.
Good. And then off the back of Oxford is where you wrote your thesis about the Windrush Scandal. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah. So before you wrote your thesis, what was your interest, or how much did you know about the Windrush Scandal?
So when I was a student doing this course in criminology, we were studying lots of things about the criminal justice system, but that included migration, because migration detention is increasingly a focus of criminal justice research because of the crossover. And mainly in The Guardian, from a journalist called Amelia Gentleman, there were lots of stories coming out that weren't new, but were seeming to kind of come more to the fore about what was happening to the Windrush generation. And my interest in that was partly a personal one. My grandparents on my mother's side came over to England from Ireland in the 1950s, and they were part of that same wave of migration to Britain after the Second World War. And they were invited here as part of rebuilding the country and the economy at a time when there were severe labour shortages. And my granddad, for his entire career, worked in car factories. My grandmother worked as a ribbon weaver, and then as a bus conductor, and then as a nurse. And being a second generation Irish immigrant, I've always been conscious that Irish immigrants have a different status and experience of being migrants to the UK. And that's largely because we're white, and it's also because of the history of the relationship between Britain and Ireland. But when I first started to hear about these stories of people from the Windrush generation being discriminated against, somehow to me it seemed obvious that injustice had to be one which was underpinned by racism to some degree, because I knew it wouldn't be happening to my Irish grandparents.
And why wouldn't it be happening to your Irish grandparents? Because they're white?
Partly, yes, it's partly about visibility. And as I found, it's also partly because there are exceptions and particular provisions within the law that make sure that migrants from Ireland have been treated in a different way to people who are from other Commonwealth countries.
Before you wrote your thesis, how would you have described your knowledge of the situation with the Windrush generation?
I suppose it was for everybody. It's a common understanding that this is a group of people who came here after the war, who are absolutely British. I did used to cycle past a square in Brixton called Windrush Square, and that was to commemorate, I think, the 50th anniversary of the boat, the Empire Windursh, coming to England, and mark the contribution of the African Caribbean community in the local area in Brixton. But it wasn't, as I say, until 2017 that I began to hear the really shocking stories of people being refused treatment for cancer, having their benefits cut off, being deported, elderly people being asked to show proof in the form of documents for every year that they've been in the UK. And for some people, that would be over 50 years worth of paperwork. And I was really just struck by the inhumanity of those measures, which all of which were intentional policies of the government.
Yeah, absolutely. So then, just to summarise, and we'll move on to and speak about the Windrush generation now. Who are, or who's, we'll say, yeah, so who are the Windrush generation?
So the Windrush generation, it generally describes migrants who came to Britain from the Caribbean in the late 1950s and 1960s. What they all share as a kind of category of people is that they all have a legal right to citizenship, to British citizenship, and it's not disputed. The citizenship legislation had developed over many years since 1948, and under the Immigration Act in 1971, they were a category of people who qualified for what was called the right to abode, because they were from a British colony and they had been continually resident in the UK for 5 or more years. So their status was secure from that time. And then in 1981, that right to abode was converted into British citizenship in the British Nationality Act 1981. But there wasn't a formal process to regularize this. It just was something that happened when you applied for a passport, if you indeed did apply for a passport. But lots of people hadn't done this, or their parents hadn't done this, and so they didn't have the paperwork to prove that they had this legal status.
They're called the Windrush generation, but why the word Windrush? Why is that significant?
The Windrush was a boat which came from Kingston in 1948, and it docked in Tilbury docks. It had, I think, just over 1,000 people on the boat, and the majority of those were from Jamaica. I suppose it was an early and memorable example of post-war migration to Britain, at a time when people being invited from other Commonwealth countries to support the country in rebuilding after the war. And at the time, the arrival of the boat, the Empire Windrush, was covered in the press quite widely, and it became later synonymous with West Indian migration to the UK around that time. And I think before what happened with the hostile environment policies, it was celebrated that we had the Windrush generation. They, as I mentioned before, there's a Windrush Square in Brixton. The Windrush boat was featured in the 2012 opening ceremony at the Olympics. So this was a key feature of the way in which we celebrate that the UK is a diverse and multiracial country.
Then why is it, so what makes it a scandal of what's happened to these people?
I mean, what these people all had in common was that they were being asked to justify their presence in the UK when they were lawfully here. They are British. They've been repeatedly failed by government bodies who asked them to prove their status. And the consequences for those individuals was really, really serious. I mean, some people were deported, people were denied access to benefits to which they were entitled, access to medical treatment. I mean, it's awful. And I think that the fact that they largely are an elderly group of people sort of help demonstrate how harsh and unjust these policies were, and help to demonstrate that policies like this are always implemented along racial and ethnic lines.
And despite this being a scandal that's happened to these people, they have obviously they were brought over to help rebuild this country after the war, as you say. So how would you summarise their contribution to modern day UK society?
I absolutely couldn't do justice to their contribution. But I mean, they came to the UK. They worked extremely hard, often in menial jobs. They put down roots here and stayed, had families, became part of our community. I say our community also is a descendant of a migrant. They are as much part of the national fabric of the UK as anybody else. And as I say before, that was well known and that was celebrated. I think when people began to hear about the mistreatment of the Windrush generation, they already had in their mind that this was a group of celebrated people, and it's something which is difficult in debates about migration, is this notion of the deserving and the undeserving migrant. And I'm sure that's something that's probably too difficult for us to explore too much detail today. But what's interesting about this as a category of people is that, generally speaking, they were and are considered to be deserving of being here, and lots of support for them came from unlikely places that would have actually supported the hostile environment policies themselves. You know, tabloid press or right-wing press were pretty uniformly shocked at the treatment of the Windrush generation as a result of the hostile environment policies.
Do you think there is any justifiable reason for the Home Office failing to keep a record of the people that were brought over?
I mean, they did keep a record of people who came here. So they did at one point, I think, have landing cards to show the names and dates and probably the date of birth of the people who came from other countries. But they destroyed them, I think, around 2009. I think it was the UK Border Agency who did that. But there was a bit of an argument between politicians as to who was responsible. I mean, it's not completely crucial that these people had their record of their landing card. But the problem is that if these people are being pushed to demonstrate that they're entitled to be in the UK, and they're being asked for information to prove that year on year since, for example, 1959, they have been resident in the UK, then something like a landing card becomes really important.
Yeah, and then sort of in years gone by, more recently, the immigration rules. What changed that meant the settled status of the Windrush generation then became under threat?
So there were a panoply of new rules in the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts. For the purposes of the thesis, I focused on just a few. I suppose what unites them all is that they were sort of a checkpoint for a person's immigration status in the UK. So there were checkpoints in new places, or the importance of those checkpoints was sort of strengthened in law. So when you were accessing public services, when you were getting married, when you were getting a new job, or renting somewhere, or accessing the NHS, there became more stringent requirements, and sometimes with a penalty for failure to comply, for people to be asked to prove their lawful status in the UK. So, just as by way of an example, the ones that I chose were firstly the right to rent policy that created a new criminal offence for landlords who rented their property to somebody who either they knew or they had reasonable cause to believe were disqualified from renting because of their immigration status. And so a landlord has to go through a number of checks to make sure that they don't fall foul of this policy. But unfortunately, what you see in practice, and I think there have been changes to this policy since, but for landlords, it was probably easier for them to go with somebody who they could be more confident of their immigration status about, and that would be, somebody with an English accent, for example, somebody who is white. So it created a real possibility, as if not actual, of discrimination against people when trying to access property. At work, there was an increase in penalties for employers who were found to be employing somebody who was an illegal worker, in inverted commas. There was, in the 2016 Immigration Act, an amendment to the rules on driving. So it became an offence to drive whilst unlawfully in the UK. And that's interesting because that's a criminal offence that isn't actually about what you do, but it's about who you are and your status as an individual while you're doing that thing, i.e. in this case, driving. So there was a real kind of intensification of the policing, not by the police, but by other institutions and individual, the policing of immigration in a way that meant that constantly people who were from this category of migrants, and also other migrants, were being asked to prove their status all the time, and that there were sanctions for failure to comply with those rules.
Then, having changed the immigration laws, as you were saying, that it became, is that where the phrase Crimmigration sort of comes into play?
Yeah, so Crimmigration is an academic umbrella term in the literature for the increasing overlap between immigration law and criminal law. The advantage to a government is that it enables a state to use the coercive power that's traditionally reserved for a criminal justice process, such as detention, and to use that in border control and in respect of flows and migration. But those are processes which run along ethnic and racial lines, and we should be concerned about that, because there are different safety checks for those two different separate processes. In the criminal law, you have many more safety checks on making sure that a person who is found to have committed an offence has actually done so. You have, only just to name a few, you have a jury, you have a right to legal representation. Those are things which aren't always guaranteed in an immigration system. And so for a government, using things like immigration offences can be quite an industrious way for the government to deal with immigration breaches, because it costs less time and it costs less money. And generally speaking, governments have done this in the UK and in other countries. They've increased the immigration consequences for criminal offending. So, for example, if you commit certain offences in certain countries, and then you've completed your sentence, you've completed your punishment, you're then eligible to be deported to your country of origin. There are more crimes now than there have been ever before, based on conduct relating to migration, and there are an increasing number of policing powers to control unlawful migration, and those aren't restricted to only the police. As I said before, they're restricted. They include other government bodies and kind of on a day-to-day basis, they would include people who do the administration of public services, having to check the immigration status of other people.
So the fact that all these are in place, could that be described as an issue of political will? Like, if you have the political desire to have all these things in place, then they will be in place?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the hostile environment was a 2010 or even before policy. And originally the government stated that it wanted to make the UK a hostile environment for criminals and a safer place in which to live. But then later it became, certainly in the debates around the 2014 immigration bill, Theresa May referred to it as to the hostile environment policies as creating a more hostile place for illegal migrants. So it's this intentional interlinking between the criminal and the migrant, which is part of the rhetoric that's led to these policies.
So that would have been, at that time, Theresa May as the Home Secretary rather than the Prime Minister?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, right. So having sort of changed the immigration laws, and as you were saying, the police having all these additional powers to enforce like immigration, or anti-immigration, sorry, what then happened to many of the Windrush generation and their descendants?
So being constantly asked to prove your status and then not being able to do so meant that people were denied access to services to which they were lawfully entitled. As I say, being denied NHS treatment for a condition which is affecting your day-to-day life, or being either losing your job or not getting a job because it appears that you don't have the right to work when you do. I mean, a lot of, I think, what would have been extremely difficult for the Windrush generation is to be living lawfully in the UK for many, many years, never to be, or one would hope, never previously have been asked, by officials to prove who you were. And then once these policies came in, it became more important for officials to be asking questions. And so I think people found themselves constantly having to go through these administrative hoops, being asked to find documentation going back to prove that they had a right to the things that they were asking for. And I think that that kind of rejection is incredibly cruel in many, many situations, but particularly when somebody has absolutely contributed to the society in which they live. They have lived here a very long time. They have worked. They have laid down roots. They, are absolutely entitled to the things that they were asking for, and yet they were being made to feel that they were not entitled to them.
And then throughout your writing process of your thesis, did you speak to any of the affected people in person?
This is a really brilliant question, and I'm so ashamed to say that I didn't. And that was because when you're doing an academic piece, you kind of have to say whether you're going to do sort of secondary source research or primary research, and there's a different process for each of those. And in the time that I had available, it would have been really challenging to go out and do interviews, for example, with people who were being affected by the policies. But to be honest, also my interest was more in how the law itself, which is supposed to be neutral, it's supposed to be the rule of law. There's supposed to be equality before the law. How these laws had actually produced an outcome where people were experiencing racism. So I was more interested in looking in a more detailed way at the laws themselves.
Got you. Makes sense. So then all this has happened. This political will has passed these laws. Anti-immigration is in force, and it's all on the back of sort of a racist undertone. Has there ever been an apology or a compensatory sort of monetary fund given to the Windrush generation for what has happened?
Yes, so there was a public apology, and Amber Rudd, who was Home Secretary at the time, I think in 2017, resigned over this issue. That was then followed up by a compensation scheme being set up in 2019. But I think a recent report showed that fewer than 700 claims had actually been paid out since the scheme was introduced. And so it sounds like it isn't really achieving the reparations that it was set up to do. And I think there's probably something quite problematic in a compensation scheme which is set up by the Home Office to compensate people for actions which were perpetrated by the Home Office. They were often the cause of the problem in the first place, and for a person who's suffered because of the hostile environment policies to then have to go back to the Home Office and navigate an application system, I think that's really, really difficult, and it doesn't sound like it's working very well. I'm really concerned about that.
Yeah, so that's essentially a person deciding if it was in terms of people, if a person's committed a crime, then they themselves decide what the sort of reparation would be. Like, oh, I'll decide whether I say sorry or not, or how much my apology's worth. It should really be an independent panel that would decide these things and would handle these things.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, at the moment, the Home Office makes the decision on the application for compensation, and it's the Home Office who do the review of that application decision if you are refused compensation. So the Home Office is the person who is largely responsible for what's happened. The Home Office is the person who determines the application, and then it's the Home Office who determine whether or not your application was decided correctly or not. So it does seem to be sort of, to me, structured into the structure of that scheme that means perhaps it's not achieving what it was set up to do.
Even in, like, aside from it not achieving what it was set up to do, would that not be a deterrent for some people? Like, that could be a potential trigger. The Home Office have caused you all these problems. Why would you then even want to go back and apply in the first place?
Exactly, and I think it's a real insult to people whose lives have been damaged by hostile environment policies to ask them to do so.
Yeah, so then like adds to the point that the 700 claims that are paid out, we will never know how many haven't been paid out, and then on top of that, you will never know how many people have been put off applying in the first place, because it's the same people who were threatening to kick them out are now saying that they'll come cap in hand and we'll sort you out in return for what we've done, which really just isn't the setup at all. Then if we sort of tie up the Windrush generation, we move into the sort of present day. So bit of an issue we've got going on just now is Brexit, as we all know. What role do you think Brexit has had or will have in that similar Crimmigration type issue in the United Kingdom?
So hostile environment policies are still in place. They, I think, referred to now by politicians as the compliant environment. But the policies are still in place, and they are very much going to continue to bite on people, including EU citizens who are in the UK now. So this is an issue which is in the news today, even. The EU citizens who are settled in the UK and need to apply for settled status since Brexit, they have to do that, I think, by the end of this month. And they have to do that to demonstrate that they're here lawfully since Brexit, before they can rent a property, work, claim benefits. And I think I read today that there's 130,000 Europeans in the UK who receive benefits and haven't yet applied for settled status. And for them, that means that their financial support could be withdrawn. So I think Brexit or no Brexit, I mean, it's too late, it's already happened now, but these policies are still in place. There hasn't been a huge reversal in those policies. The laws underlying them have not been repealed. And so the crossover between immigration and criminal law in these policies is going to continue to have, in my view, a negative effect on the people who they catch.
You obviously are very familiar with the hostile environment and all the elements that make that up. Is there a pathway for the United Kingdom to become less hostile in that sense?
I mean, in the context of hostile environment policies, I think that back in the debates on the immigration bill in 2014, MPs, I know Diane Abbott, she raised the issue that these measures could impact British nationals who might, look like they're immigrants. And Caroline Lucas, she also said the bill was nasty, it was punitive, and then it would risk more racism. The problem about these policies is that you don't see a quote unquote an illegal immigrant. You see a person who looks different to you. And I don't think that we as a country are hostile, actually. But what I think is that if you ask institutions and individuals who work for them to police the status of an individual, you make suspicion legitimate, because you kind of allow people to look for signs and signals in a subjective way that that person is unlawfully in the country. And those kind of the factors that people think of when they think of I don't like to use the term, but an illegal immigrant, they will use the color of a person's skin, their hair, the way they dress, their accent, their family members, their nationality, and I think that power dynamic, if it's a government policy, if it stays this way, it's going to result in continued racism and xenophobia.
If the country continues to move to the right, broadly speaking, what effect do you think this will have on policing and immigration?
I mean, I don't think this is a party political issue in the sense that it's part of a xenophobia that's been building for quite a long time, and it's part of a narrative that distracts from the fact that there have been cuts to public services for the past over 10 years now, and blames those cuts on migration. So I don't know. I mean, I guess you take the recent police crime and sentencing in courts bill as one example, that that resulted in the Kill the Bill protests earlier this year. And that gives sweeping powers to the Home Secretary to decide what assemblies, processions, and protests are deemed noisy or that cause serious alarm or distress. And its stated aim is that it protects the community from disruption. But actually, what it does is it vests more powers in the state to police things which the state does not think are appropriate. And what I think is a lesson that we can learn from the Windrush example is that there had been an overreach of criminal law. Their stories highlighted the limits of the hostile environment policies. And so I think they've taught us to be very wary of an increase in criminal offending, and hopefully to be more aware of the subjectivity that there is in the application of those powers.
And just to round off this section, how much faith do you have in things get improving in that light, or do you just foresee it just?
I really don't know. I have at times during the pandemic felt hopeful that there could be a kind of real shift in society in many ways in the next few years. I don't know. I think that when I did this research about the Windrush generation and the laws affecting them, I did feel hopeful because there was a widespread public support eventually for those people, and there was a recognition that what they had been through wasn't acceptable at all. And so that at the time gave me some reason to be optimistic. But I think, as I think you'll agree, it's very difficult to know at the moment what's going to happen next.
Just that the current government situation, you never know what's coming next, and I think it's hard to look forward with any certainty, positive or negative, because both everything and nothing surprises you anymore.
Yeah,
of what happens.
yeah, you're right.
But no, just then that rounds that off, and just talk about you and the present tense. You now work as a lawyer researcher for Burnberg Pierce. Talk to me a bit about what that involves.
So I work as a researcher for a solicitors firm called Burnberg Pierce. I work in the criminal defence department. The firm has a long-standing history of representing people in quite important criminal cases over the past 50 or so years. My role in particular is somewhat related to the subject of thesis, which is to work on cases where there is a crossover between criminal offending and other areas of law. So I work on a number of cases, but some are extradition cases, which always have a political dimension. I work on some cases relating to deprivation of citizenship, and some cases relating to antisocial behaviour powers. So it's a fascinating place to work, and it's a privilege to be working on behalf of clients who are they're either criminal defendants or they are claimants resisting a government policy that affects them.
Your job sort of fits in with your values, and I think that must be really fulfilling for you. And I would totally accept that the situation that these clients you work with is probably really dire. But for you, it sounds as though you're doing something that is making a difference in the way that you would have wanted to.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think sort of the longer I work in this sort of area, the more difficult I realise it is, not only because, as you say, people are in such dire circumstances and that doesn't seem to be improving, but also because there's been so many cuts to legal aid that your ability to do your job becomes more and more difficult, because it's hard for firms who do this kind of work to survive. But yeah, I mean, I could not work the hours that I do, because sometimes it's long, without really fully believing that the people who the firm represent are, absolutely deserving of the highest quality legal representation that they can have. So it is really important to me to be part of an organisation that has those values. Yes.
So can I ask then, I don't know what I expect the answer to be here, but see in an average week, how many hours do you think you work?
It really depends. I think it fluctuates. I'm actually
best case and worst case scenario.
I mean, worst case scenario, I think, if I'm thinking back to a time when I was in the middle of a hearing, kind of 70 something hours a week. But I feel really hesitant to tell you that, because it's just the reality of the job sometimes. I mean, it's what I really don't want to do is to sound like I'm being macho about that, because I really don't think it's a good thing. But it is the reality, because very often things happen in legal cases at the last minute, and you absolutely have to work hard to make sure that you meet a deadline, or are ready to move a case forward in that way. So it's not always that case, but it can be, and I think that it comes with certain areas of law. It is the reality, yeah.
And there you have it. Big thanks to this week's guest, Niamh, for her time. Niamh's Twitter, as well as the link to her dissertation, can be found in the show notes. Use your bits and pieces for me to see you out. The best way to keep up to date with future episodes of Lost for Words is to follow using the handle @LostForWordsPod on both Twitter and Instagram. To support the show, hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and if you are an Apple Podcast user, the best way to help us out is to give a 5-star review. If you like what you hear, then even consider telling someone, because word of mouth is also really powerful in helping us to grow. That is all from me for this week. I am your host Jason, and this has been The Windrush Scandal with Niamh Quille. I hope to see you back next week for another episode of the Lost for Words podcast.